Welcome everyone to the Ontology Summit 2023. Today is the 25th of January 2023, and this is the second session of the Ontology Summit. I have shown there the webpage for our meeting today. I'd like to remind everyone that we do have a chat room, a SOPUB chat, and you should put your remarks there if possible. So this is SOPUB chat. And if you do put your remarks in the Zoom chat, that's okay too. I'll just transfer them to the main chat. So with that, I would like now to we'll start the meeting. The co-chairs are Gary Burcross and James Overton, and James will be running the meeting today. So James, could you take the
Yep, very happy to, thank you. Yeah, so I'm delighted to introduce Chris Mungall to give our presentation today, our first major session in the 2023 Ontology Summit. Chris is absolutely central to the OBO community and the gene ontology. He's worked on all sorts of tooling issues, but he also has a great understanding of the kind of science and workflows and how curation gets done in the field. He's absolutely central to our community, and he's been a great friend to me over the years. Chris is PI on the Gene Ontology, Monarch Initiative, Alliance of Genome Resources, Phenomics First, NCAT's Biomedical Data Translator, and he was awarded the Exceptional Contributions to Biocuration Award by the International Society for Biocuration, which I think is absolutely deserved. And I was delighted when he won that award. I think it was a bit of a surprise at the time. Chris is going to talk to us today about kind of upper ontologies in the OBO Foundry, and especially the core ontology for biology and biomedicine. And I had a glimpse at his slides, and they're full of really fascinating stuff. So I'm super excited about this kind of kickoff to our Ontology Summit. And yeah, thank you, Chris, for doing this. I'll turn it over to you.
All right, thanks, James. Thanks for the lovely introduction, and thank you and Gary for putting this whole series together. I think this is going to be great, and I'm really happy to be part of this. Okay, yeah. So as James said, I'm going to be mostly talking about COB, the core ontology for biology, but also maybe a little bit about how we got here, and talking about some other upper level ontologies within OBO along the way. But just because I know we've got a diverse crowd here, some of you, some familiar faces, but some people I don't know. I think we've got maybe like a 50-50 split of people coming from the bio ontology world versus kind of those of you coming from maybe other domains as well. So just to kind of give you a sense of the domain that we work in, we have like a huge number of different named entities within biology and within biomedicine. From like 9 million species to kind of like, potentially kind of like, trillions of chemicals, billions of genes. And we need to be able to organize this, and we need to be able to categorize this, and we need to be able to put all of these things that we're tracking in our databases into neat little categories and bins, and organize them and link them together in a rational fashion. And this is kind of fun because all of these things in these databases don't stand in isolation. Biology, like many areas of science, of course, is connected across different scales. And we often like to look at things and see how things are connected across different scales, right the way from kind of like the chemical level through to individual chemical entities like alcohol or ethanol, right the way up through kind of through cells, through whole organs and organ systems, and look at how those give rise to health in humans and other organisms, and how health can be dysregulated. So a lot of different things at different scales. And we've got a lot of different perspectives on these things as well. So, you know, you can have a more static kind of three-dimensional perspective on some of these entities where you know, break things down into kind of like states or anatomy, subcellular structures and their relationships right the way down to chemical structures. And you can also look at these things in a more dynamic fashion as well, where the same entities, you kind of like twist things around and look at it from more like a 4D perspective, and you can see how things are connected, not just in space, but in time as well. And the classic example in biochemistry here are things like biochemical reactions and pathways. One chemical entity can be transformed into another, and how these can be chained together, essentially in a kind of like factory-like process within cells, where the cells act as kind of production lines for making different kinds of chemicals. And this all kind of like gives rise to dynamical kind of systems in human physiology, and when that goes wrong, disease pathophysiology as well. So I think many of you have heard a bit about OBO already, so I won't go into too much detail here, but just to kind of like the main key point here is OBO, the Open Biomedical and Biological Ontologies Foundry, is a framework for organizing all of these different things. It's a system whereby we can help ontology developers work together to make modular ontologies that fit together, using a lot of different kind of like tools that we'll hear about in other talks in these series, and essentially allow us to kind of like piece together these ontologies and integrate them and make them all findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable, and all that good stuff. So OBO itself constitutes, you know, well over 100 ontologies. You can see this on the OBO site, and we now have a nice new kind of like browser on the site where you can look at all of the different ontologies by the different domains in which they cover. You can see we're covering you know, a broad swathe of different domains here, from like agriculture and environments right the way through down to kind of like diet and metabolomics, chemistry, right the way up to kind of like whole organisms and whole environments and so on. So there's a lot of diverse different ontologies in there, and these ontologies largely interoperate with one another. So this diagram shows some of the most widely used in ontologies within OBO, such as the gene ontology. These ontologies don't just stand in isolation. The terms within the ontologies are interlinked with other terms, and they actually depend on them via OWL axiomatization to essentially get their structure. And you'll hear some more about that in some of the other talks in this series. But, you know, essentially the idea is an ontology like the human phenotype ontology, used for diagnosing rare disease patients, can describe phenotypes in terms of underlying anatomy or chemical structures or cell types, or biological processes in the Go, and these Go terms also depend on terms in other ontologies such as KEBI. So we can look at interoperability in OBO in terms of these four levels within a pyramid. The top level, we've got kind of like shared design templates. Below that, we've got the kind of like the core upper ontologies, the relation ontology, COB, and then the levels beneath that include things like our tooling, such as robot, and then the base layer for all of this is just essentially making everything kind of like fair and open. And so you'll hear about some of this in other talks, but today we're going to be focusing on these this kind of upper level integration, which consists at some level of these four different ontologies: the relation ontology, OMO, standardized annotation properties. So this is things like definition, synonym, creator, and so on. This is a super important ontology, but it doesn't really kind of like fit in with what we're going to talk about today. So I've grayed that out. And then the two kind of key upper ontologies are COB, Common Ontology for Biology, and BUFO, the Basic Formal Ontology, which essentially forms a layer of abstraction above COB. So why do we have so many different kind of like things in here in this box? Well, I think it might help to just kind of give a bit of a historic perspective here as to the kind of winding road by how we got to where we are within within OBO with these opera ontologies and how they interrelate with one another. So we can maybe trace the start of this winding road back down to the original relation ontology paper, which is almost two decades old now. So this this paper here came from a lot of this was driven by Barry Smith's early work, and many of you will know him, of course. And so the original version of the relation ontology was designed as a common domain neutral ontology with generic relationships such as is a part of, located in, contained, and so on, plus a first order logic axiomatization of those terms. Now, the original idea was that RO would be modeled using directly using first order logic. For various reasons, OWL started taking off in the kind of like the mid 2000s. So it made sense for us to really kind of like adopt OWL wholesale and to use OWL as the substrate for modeling the relation ontology. And so you can see the screenshot from Protege gives you a kind of like sense of how RO is modeled with OWL. So we have relationship types in RO, such as the located in. Like everything in OBO, it's got a semantic free Perl or identifier, such that we can change the label if need be. Things have definitions, and there's some loose axiomatization here in terms of transitivity of the object properties and so on. And if you don't like looking at Protege or OLS or any of the ontology browsers, we try and provide as detailed a documentation as we can with all of these ontologies. So you can read more about RO on the RO website. Now, the OWL version of RO, due to kind of like various needs from the OBO community, grew to go beyond what we're calling the core relationships to include a number of different domain-specific relationships as well. So we decided to modularize this, and we took one part of RO that roughly corresponded to the original RO paper. We called that RO core, made that something that it was very easy to import and use within your own ontologies, independent of all the domain-specific stuff. And then the full RO includes these domain-specific relations as well. And these include things like ecological relationships, such as this fungus is a parasite of this particular ant species. Genomic relationships, such as expressed in, so that you can say something like this particular gene is expressed in this cell type or this tissue. And so these domain relations are incredibly useful for databases and knowledge graphs and ontologies that cover specific domains in biology. So of course, we then kind of like as we're axiomatizing this, we needed to essentially express things like domain and range constraints. So you don't want to be able to use the expressed in relationship to connect anything to anything. We want the ontology to include rigorous constraints about what kinds of things can be expressed and what kinds of other things, or what kinds of things can occur in other things. So the question is what to put in the different boxes here. And so, of course, for some of the domain-specific relationships, the domain and range constraints are naturally domain-specific classes from ontologies. But for the more general relationships, the domains and ranges are from more abstract or kind of like less domain-specific ontologies. So, a process can occur in an independent continuant, but an independent continuant cannot occur in a process. So, and I'll get to what an independent continuant is in a moment. But yeah, so essentially, what we were able to do is to express these domain and range constraints for the domain-specific object properties is essentially use root nodes from existing OBO ontologies. So the SO, the sequence ontology, has a term for gene, and Caro, an anatomy ontology, has the concept for material anatomical entity. And then when it came to the domain neutral relationships, Buffo is, of course, an actual choice here. And these generic relations, of course, fit in nicely with Buffo because a lot of the people who developed a lot of the the original parts of RO were also the developers of Buffo. So it's kind of like natural that we can use Buffo classes for these more abstract domain and range constraints. Okay, so I mentioned Buffo. I'm guessing with this crowd here, I think most of you probably are quite familiar with Buffo already, but this diagram here kind of like, this may not be up to date with the latest Buffo 2, but it kind of gives you a sense, at least of the organization of Buffo. It kind of divides the world at the joints, you might say, into kind of like a top level of independent continuants, generically dependent continuants. Actually, this is only showing the continuant branch, specifically dependent continuants, and then kind of like further divides things into qualities, realizable entities. And you can trace back the lineage to this right the way back to Aristotelian philosophy and Aristotle's subdivision of the world into qualities, substances, and so on. So this serves as a useful shared set of philosophical abstractions across OBO. It's not intended as a biological upper layer. It's more of a way of kind of like, making sure that you can be very precise with the terms in your ontology about what they mean according to these kind of like philosophical, kind of like abstract ways of looking at the world. While this can definitely kind of like be very useful for rooting your ontology in this level of precision, sometimes it does lead to confusion. So there's, what we essentially see is that for any one individual concept that we might have in one of our ontologies, like the concept of a heart from an anatomical ontology, Buffo gives us this range of different aspects for talking about that thing. We could be talking about the material entity itself. We could be talking about its site or its spatial region, the processes that occur within the heart, or the history of that heart, and so on. And each of these things has their own place within the Buffo universe and their own kind of like one-to-one relationship that can connect them. But this can be kind of confusing for people who are not used to modeling things in this way. And what we tend to find within OBO is that we often end up with a bit of duplication across ontologies, where someone's kind of like branched out the concept, a certain kind of concept within one hierarchy, and another group is dealing with another aspect of it, when really we should be taking a more unified approach to this. I've got a blog post on this if you're interested in reading more on that. And then the other issue is that some of these high-level philosophical abstractions can be a little bit leaky, and we see this when people go to ontology browsers to look at our terms. The poor biologist gets kind of like overwhelmed by having to drill down on these kind of like high-level concepts that aren't necessarily very, very meaningful for them. They just want to kind of like look at the terms in their domain of interest, such as devices and assays and so on. So, I think there's maybe a little bit of, a problem here, that the level of abstraction can be a little bit too high here. So, so I'd put a bit of a Taylor Swift meme in there for, I'm not sure if this is the right crowd to to get that one, but anyway, this, essentially, we decided that we needed essentially an upper level that was more biologist friendly, and it would essentially provide a parent for every concept within every OBO ontology, that it should be anchored in Buffo, but it should hide this overall complexity from its end users. And that this ontology should include complete logical axioms, so that we could be able to use COB as a way of checking to make sure that ontologies within OBO are conformant with our upper level. And so this led to the development of COB, the Common Ontology for Biology and Biomedicine. It's a full-blown OBO ontology, just like others. You can read about it and find out, get links to the documentation and the latest version of the ontology and the GitHub tracker on our OBO site. And there's complete documentation within here as well. I'll give you a sense of some of this. But the basic approach we took to developing COB was to, essentially take more of a bottom up rather than a top down approach. So rather than trying to kind of like divide the world from like, the most abstract concept possible into kind of other abstract concepts, we took a bottom up approach. We looked at what the root level terms or the native root level terms were in existing OBO ontologies. So, within the chemical entity ontology, you may have a concept like atom. Within the cell ontology, naturally, the most general concept there is cell. So really starting with these kind of like root level nodes, we kind of assembled them together and then looked at commonalities and kind of like figured out which ones would make sense to take and plop into the initial version of COB. And so our basic methodology was to create what we're calling shadow classes of these upper level terms rather than use them directly. And there's a number of reasons for this. If you simply try and use all these root nodes directly, it leads to various kinds of inconsistencies. So we decided we needed to, at least as part of an experimental stage, make essentially copies of these and then kind of like maybe change the labels or modify the semantics somewhat. But we retain mappings back between the COB classes and the original root nodes in the cell ontology. And if we don't modify the semantics, we retain an equivalence axiom linking the two of them. But in cases such as with the concept of atom in Kebi, which we had a hard time kind of integrating into the overall COB structure, we decided we essentially needed to make some semantic changes. So there's no longer an equivalence axiom that connects these things together. So you can, we make all of these mappings kind of available in the standard SSSOM format within the COB site. And then we actually use this in the release version of the COB. So we essentially swap back out the COB IDs for the native OBO root IDs. So if you actually download COB, then it looks kind of like something like this, where you've got, it's essentially kind of like a curated assemblage of the top level terms within OBO, and where appropriate, linking up to other broader concepts. So we do make use of a subset of Buffo here. So all of these top level OBO root nodes, cell, organism, gross anatomical part, subclass, the Buffo concept for material entity. So we have a development process for COB. The initial ontology was hammered out over a series of workshops, mostly centered around ICBO, the International Conference for Biomedical Ontologies. But a lot of the ongoing work takes place in GitHub issue trackers and on Slack. So we try and employ modern GitHub-based workflows as far as possible. If you don't know what that means, I really recommend you come to the ODK talk that is going to be next month. And the basic idea is that the process is as open as possible, conducted publicly on GitHub, and anyone can make comments on issues, can make PRs or make that's pull requests, or can make comments on these pull requests. So here's an example here of someone from the community who came in to make changes to some of our mappings back to Kebi. So just to give you a sense of how COB is anchored within the more general Buffo ontology, the nodes here in yellow represent COB classes, and the nodes in gray represent dark gray represent Buffo classes, and then maybe the lighter gray represent kind of like specific classes from some of these individual ontologies. So you can see that there's some overlap. So for example, process is a class in COB, but it's in bold here because it's also present in Buffo as well. So you can see this essentially gives kind of like an insulating layer on top of Buffo. It's all consistent with Buffo, but for the average user, this is the set of top level classes that they will see: process, material, entity, site, characteristic, and so on. And maybe for some of our tastes, this is already still a little bit too abstract and not something that a biologist would find to be familiar. So, but it's an ongoing kind of like community process how we arrive at some of these characterizations. Just to kind of give you a sense of the material entity branch of COB, We try and organize things in terms of like the level of granularity from smaller entities like subatomic particle through to population. And again, here, the nodes in yellow represent COB classes, the nodes in blue represent specific classes from individual ontologies, such as the gene ontology or KEBI and so on. Then again, we have a non-material branch as well. It's where we start getting a little bit into some of the more abstract concepts here as well. But I think uncontroversially, there's classes such as process that can be subdivided into programmed biological processes represented in the gene ontology, plant processes represented in OBI and so on, qualities, characteristics. This diagrams may be a little bit out of date with the current version of COB, but it should give you a sense of how things are organized here. And again, some more kind of like examples of how things are organized. So COB is by no means finished. It's an ongoing work. I think we've done a pretty good job with some of the less controversial elements, such as material entities. There's a number of challenges ahead of us. One of the main ones is representing phenotypes and diseases. And so these are some of the most, the absolutely key critical ontologies within OBO. They underpin our understanding of genetics and disease pathophysiology, how genes relate to disease and so on. But the challenge here is that a lot of the assumptions you get in upper ontologies don't quite align with how biologists might think about phenotypes and diseases. From a philosophical standpoint, it definitely makes sense to subdivide things into material entities, into qualities and realizations and processes and so on. But from a practical point of view, most of the time we just want to kind of like lump these things together and to conflate things. And I just want to highlight a paper. This is over 10 years old now. This is one of my favorite papers from Stefan Schultz. And it shows a way in which it's possible to essentially conflate some of these upper level distinctions to create essentially union classes within your biological ontology, and yet at the same time retain in the background the formalization that you get from your upper ontology. So as a figure from the paper, it looks a little bit abstract if you're not familiar with description logic symbolism, but this just demonstrates there's a nice kind of like formal underpinning to this. So we've yet to decide how we're going to represent things like phenotypes and diseases in COB. And so we welcome all of you to join in with some of that discussion. There's also ongoing work that I think we can say is almost done, kind of like refining the way we model units and measurements within COB. I think historically, people have used maybe a model that has led to essentially too many different kind of like blank nodes and too many distinct kind of like entities. But we're now, arriving on, I think, something that is a little bit more standard with how measurements are modeled within ontologies like QUDT and so on, but at the same time retains compatibility to Buffalo. So we should hopefully have something to announce there quite soon. And then there's still ongoing work with aligning COB with a number of other upper ontology efforts. So this is one project that I'm, with my non-COB hat on, I'm part of this NCATS Biomedical Translator project. So this is the National Center for Advancing Translational Science. I think there's some people from that project on this call just now. And what we're trying to do essentially is come up with a standard exchange format for knowledge graphs within the biomedical translational domain. And so in order to do this, we essentially had to come up with a set of kind of like upper level categories to be able to kind of like structure our knowledge graphs. And we definitely tried to align with COB as much as possible here. But the working groups for this was very much driven by non-ontologists, people who are kind of like bioinformaticians and domain specialists. So what you ended up here with is even less focus on some of the upper ontology abstractions, and essentially we just kind of like created nodes for diseases and phenotypic features and so on, without really worrying too much about how they fit in within an overall broader kind of ontological framework. And that tended to work quite well for this project. Maybe for ontology-based projects, that's a little bit too loose, but there's essentially kind of like ongoing work and with these two projects and with aligning their models together. So with that, just maybe can briefly conclude. So COB provides a common biological upper level for OBO. COB wasn't just built top down de novo. It's composed largely bottom up from the roots of existing terms within OBO ontologies. Is fully compatible with, but yet it largely insulates the common user from some of the abstractions within Buffo. And perhaps most importantly, it's fully open. It's open for anyone can. It's got a CC0 license. Anyone can download it and use it, and it's got a completely open process whereby we do all our development in the open. We welcome any and all contributions from everyone. So with that, I'll leave with a couple of links, and I think we have lots of time left for some. I believe we're going into the discussion phase now. So thank you.
Thanks, Chris. I believe the next thing is that Torsten was going to make some comments.
Torsten Hamann might make some comments.
Should we first take some questions? I can wait.
Shall I? So
There were some hands up.
And Nico's question his hand at the same time.
All right, Kai, I saw first. So Kai, please ask your question.
Yeah, thanks everyone. Great job, Chris. So basically a question from Damien Dooley and myself. I won't read the whole thing, but basically the question is really about the IDs for both the terms as well as prefixes. So can we assume that we understand that there's the equivalency mappings for the most part within the SSOM files between the original, whatever ontology term and its ID and the new COB ID. But is this also true of object properties? So for example, specified input of has a COB prefix and it has an equivalency within OB, but we were a little confused about that because we thought COB would kind of stay away from minting common properties and instead have that be within RO. Sorry, this is a very technical question, but it's kind of an interest to people.
No, it's a very practical one as well. And I think you've just discovered probably just a little leak in the release process. I think we should swap out those COB object property IDs using the equivalent property axioms in the same way that we do for classes. It just hasn't been, that just slipped through the cracks. So if you make an issue for that, that would be great. And I think, unlike with the classes, I believe, James or others, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think we largely retain equivalence at the object property level. But yeah, there may be a few cases where we've got some placeholders within COB that could be replaced by ones in RO core or the main RO. But I think that should be a bit more of a straightforward task than doing it for the classes where we see a lot of this semantic.
Okay. So to be clear, we should be using the RO prefix.
Yes.
Okay.
But we need to change the release pack because you shouldn't have to do any work there. It should just be the case that when you download the public RO, they should be the public COB, they should be the RO IDs in there.
Cool. Thanks, Kai. Thanks, Chris. Nico says he can't talk, but he had the next question in the chat. So he says, a question I keep being asked is how do we align with COB in a practical sense?
So I think I would divide this into kind of like new ontologies versus existing ontologies. So with new ontologies, I would strongly encourage that when you're creating your ontology for the first time, you just directly import COB and you start populating your classes underneath the relevant COB classes. And in later talks, we'll hear about the ontology development kit and how you get started with an ontology and how you can set things up such that you can take an import of the relevant terms. But I would just say for existing new ontologies, just go ahead and start using it directly. For some existing ontologies, there's a bit more work involved because there's a bit of rewiring that has to happen, but I think that should largely be engineering work. And I would just largely encourage groups to start swapping out, changing their import pipelines to start using COB right now.
All right. Thanks, Chris. Yeah. Torsten, would you like to comment at this point?
Sure, I can do that. Yeah, so thank you, Chris, for the talk. I think Gary kind of had reached out to me because I'm kind of also working on kind of these mid-level ontologies just on the earth science, in the earth science domain, geosciences. And I actually do see a lot of parallels there. And I wonder whether this is actually a trend within the overall community, like how mature ontologies have gotten, that early on there was a lot of development in terms of like top level ontologies, and then people wondered, well, how do they actually help me solve my problems? And then people started developing like very specific ontologies, like domain ontologies, application ontologies. And now I think we're kind of going up a little bit again to try to tie those things together, because there's like a gap in between them. And we realize now, at least that's my sense, that there is some value in some of these top level concepts. They're just difficult for most people to use. So to kind of figure out, when you see a lot of existing ontologies, what are the common concepts within that domain, is really helpful. And that's what I see COP is doing. And I've been doing in the geoscience domain, like with HIFO, like the hydrological foundational ontology, where we kind of took the same approach, like used a bunch of existing ontologies from the hydrological domain and tried to figure out what's common to them, what are the key concepts that actually help to integrate those. I do have some slides, but in the interest of time, I'd rather have some discussion, open discussion, rather than doing like a couple slides.
Yeah, no, I think that's a good kind of like summary of our kind of like, path, how we got here, that we're, some people think of OBO as this giant top down level thing, and we're all on the same page and we're all marching towards the same goal. But the reality is there's some groups over here and they're working, developing this thing this way, and it's a bit more top down, and there's these groups over here and it's a bit more bottom up. And we all talk and we come together at conferences and we try and largely align, but it's a highly imperfect process. And I like the way you kind of like described this, of the way in which we kind of like got here by some of us doing, and it would be interesting to see exactly what kind of parallels there are in both the process and other domains, because I imagine it was largely easier for us because at least we were all when we built COB, it wasn't like we were bringing together completely random ontologies who had never spoken to one another. These were ontologies that were all within the OBO framework already, and even though we had kind of like an imperfect alignment with any upper ontology, we were nominally all coordinating. So I don't know how much that experience would transfer to other domains. But the other thing that would be interesting to explore is how much of COB is generalizable beyond biomedicine. And I'd say probably quite a bit is, once you're looking at material entities at the level below cells, you've got kind of like small molecules and chemical entities, and then at the level above organisms, you've got environments and so on. So it would be useful to see And this is a subject of ongoing discussion within the COB community. How much should we be just focused on where our funding is coming from, which is like largely kind of like institutes' interest in biology versus, you know, working with other groups such as yours to try and kind of find kind of like, you know, true kind of like scientific shared upper level terms.
Yeah, I find, especially kind of for what you just mentioned, the material entities, it's actually quite complicated across domains. Like, I mean, I've seen them in like the geosciences, and now I started working on a project in kind of material science, where a material or a substance is very different than kind of a pure substance in, let's say, in chemistry. And what they ascribe to materials are different kind of properties, and is there actually something in common to them? So it seems easier than done sometimes.
Yeah, but yeah, I'd caution against reading KEBI as being the kind of like the uniform representation of how everyone in biomedicine thinks as well. There's, when we all look at KEBI, we all say, yes, the substance branch especially causes a lot of people a lot of confusion because we all understand a very different thing by the term chemical substance.
Cool. Yeah, there's more to say about that, but we maybe there are a few more questions in the chat about if there's plans for phenotype/disease integration in COB or plan/roadmap. I don't know if you can see the chat. Chris, Nico did have his reply there.
I can summarize some of that. So yeah, as I showed in the slide, this has been one of the more challenging areas. I don't know if we've got a roadmap per se. We have no shortage of opinions here. You know, this is one of the fun things and the curses of working on upper ontologies is it's very easy to kind of come in and have an opinion about what a phenotype is. And I'm sure a phenotype is a material entity, and someone else says, no, I've got a very good argument for why we should model phenotypes as processes. And someone else says, you know, realizable entities and so on. And, you know, we're all right in a way. So this has led to, you know, it's been quite hard to progress here, but, you know, myself, I'm quite optimistic about what I'm calling this Schultzian conflation methodology. Others are a little bit more kind of like skeptical. You know, we've seen this works, you know, for us at least in the Biolink world. So I think there's just kind of like ongoing kind of like discussions here. And I think some of this is largely going to be driven by this UPheno effort that Nico mentions in the chat. We've got some people, Sue Bello and others from this effort here as well. So I think, yeah, at the end of the day, I think, you know, a lot of this will be, you know, needs to be driven by the groups who are actually kind of like building these phenotype ontologies and organizing all of this phenotype data. But it's an ongoing discussion, and anyone is welcome to join in on the GitHub issue. I don't know if you can find that, Nico.
Cool. Thanks. Thanks for that question. Ravi, would you like to ask your question? I can't hear you if you're asking, Ravi. You're still muted, but you're the one with your hand up.
I'm sorry. I was having, I had my mic muted. So can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yep.
Thank you. The main question, actually, I have a couple smaller ones, but the main question is phenotypes and genotypes, right? The phenotypes are combination of extra genetic factors, such as, you know, we find certain kinds of cancers are not genetic, they are more from environmental factors that ultimately might express as genes. So this is what my question is. Have you been able to see any correlation between phenotypes and genotypes in these tools or techniques that you are developing?
I think the answer is yes. I mean, I think a lot of people on this call are our funding call comes from exploring, the relationship between genotype and phenotype, or between environment and phenotype, and trying to tease these things out. So, and yes, we have we have no shortage of tools that are dependent on ontologies that help give insights into relationships between genotype and phenotype. We actually have, within the MARC initiative, we have tools like Exomizer that are actually deployed in the clinic that will make use of genes annotated and disease is annotated using phenotype ontology terms in both humans and model organisms, and make use of that to try and essentially predict what some of the underlying variants might be in a rare disease. So the answer to that is very much yes. But in some ways, that whole question is very orthogonal to where do you place a phenotype in an upper ontology. You can go back to the original, phenotype is genotype plus environment formulation from Johansson and so on, but it's a nice way of looking at it, but it doesn't necessarily tell you, where it belongs in an upper ontology. And maybe where it belongs in an upper ontology isn't such a relevant distinction if we're already making such good progress without having resolved this issue.
No, yes, I was not referring to upper ontology. Ontology, I was more referring to overlaps, where like we are trying to separate domain overlaps, and we still have difficulties. Sometimes we want things that have gaps to come and overlap, and sometimes we want separation. So these two different directions are important, and I was interested in little bit comments from you on the expressed in relationship. How that is more important or less important compared to the other one that you showed.
I think that our terms are like, maybe like children or something like that. You don't really have favorites. It depends what you want to do. I think when some of us are working with our molecular biology hat, then knowing which genes are expressed in which cell types or tissues are incredibly important. There's like new single cell sequencing data for which we're learning kind of like, incredible new things about how cell types are organized, making use of kind of gene expression data, and that's incredibly important. And these use cases overlap with the phenotype ones, but I think there's no there's no such thing as more important or less important here in general. It depends on your use case.
Thank you.
Torsten, did you have maybe a reply?
Yes, I just want to kind of bring this to a broader point, because I think it's something that I've seen quite a bit, that especially this alignment with the upper ontology, that's probably the most intricate part, where you really need like a lot of experience with both the upper ontologies and with the domain. That's typically not the work that's suitable for a domain expert only. That's like where the ontology expert comes in and play. But once you have that alignment, you can do underneath whatever you want to do, or the other way around. You can do underneath first, kind of build the ontology of phenotypes, and then worry about where to stick it. I think these are two separate problems that we can actually separate nicely to who should do it.
But yeah, just to add on the intricacy of the upper ontology alignment, I think, as you say, domain expertise, upper ontology expertise, but also expertise in some of the more nuanced OWL reasoning issues that you get, because it's very easy to make an ontology on paper and say, this is how the world is. Sometimes it's only years later, after you've tried deploying it, that you start realizing you have these kind of like, subtle kind of nuanced kind of like issues where the OWL reasoner is not giving you the results you expect. And it's due to some kind of like, quite intricate thing at the upper level of how you've subdivided things, and it doesn't quite align with people's mental models. So I think we need to, to bring more of an engineering focus to a lot of this, as well as just simply yeah, kind of ontological focus.
Yeah, that's a whole another issue. That are like all the language dependent issues.
Very, very complex, if I may butt in here. The cell level genetic expression is what you talked about to keep the entity kind of under control, but are the total genetic tools and solutions through these ontologies, are they not confined to cell level only, or is there a intercellular genetic expression?
I mean, genes are expressed in cells, I guess, but there's obviously, there's different distribution of cells. So, you can definitely, a lot of the time it's assayed at the bulk tissue level. So yeah, no, I think the answer to your question is yeah, at all levels.
Oh, at all levels. So then if I have a collection of cells, maybe in vivo, while some experiments can be done, would they show the same gene pool, or would there be some additional to a single cell one?
It depends a lot, but yeah, right these days, the focus is on cell level and teasing apart some of the differences that you see. But yeah, obviously there's homogeneity at some levels, and it depends on the tissue you're looking at, if you're looking at the brain or liver or whatever. So
Thank you. That's very wonderful. So there's a lot of scope of, obviously, the entire lot of NIH and NCBI and so on teams are working. Where do you see the future directions? More in the understanding of stem cell type work, or where do the fixes appear to be coming from? Not by ontological knowledge, but by the domain knowledge of your experts that you work with.
yeah, I think they all contribute.
Thanks.
Cool. We probably have time for one more question. Anyone who hasn't had a chance to speak, like to join in? Yeah, Frank, go ahead.
Yes, thanks. So I was wondering, as you were talking about the engineering of the ontology, maybe COB itself, or maybe domain ontologies. So have you used any kind of modeling patterns? I think on one of your slides you mentioned something at the very top, which was referring to patterns.
Absolutely, and you can hear more about those on is it the February the 8th one or 15th? I forget, but later talks in the series will go into a lot more detail on both the tooling and patterns itself. So we'll hear about kind of like robot templates, DOS-TPs, and some of the work that I think Pascal Hitzler has been doing as well. So yeah, but yes, the answer is we're heavily dependent on design patterns. Otherwise, you just kind of go crazy trying to organize all of these different terms. And there is a relationship between the upper ontology and the design patterns that I think has not yet been fully explored, that we're working on.
Thanks.
Yeah, and yes, we'll have a few talks about how OBO is using design patterns and templates, and then in the second half of the summit, we'll have talks from people outside the OBO community who may have different approaches that we can learn from. Just the one thing I'd add there, Chris, is that we do have, like, inside our OBO projects, we are making extensive use of ontology design patterns, but we've kind of only started to, I think, do a better job of using, like, having cross-project patterns kind of at the whole OBO level. And that's like an additional level of coordination, which is tricky. A bunch of the comments in the SOAP Hub have been about, like, requirements, developing requirements for these kinds of representations. And yeah, I think inside individual projects, people do that. They develop requirements, they build their patterns, they implement them. But we're kind of at somewhat early days doing that at the whole OBO community level, but I think making progress. Yeah, if you want to add your 2 cents to that, you can go ahead, Chris. Otherwise,
No,
I would
I
just
agree
wrap up.
completely. That was well summarized. Yeah.
Thanks. All right, then I'm going to wrap up. We're almost at the hour. Thank you so much, Chris, for coming and giving this talk. I really loved it. And thank you for everyone joining and participating, asking your questions. I think this was a really great session. And next week, the next session in the Ontology Summit, I'm going to be presenting the first part on Robot, which is our kind of command line tool for automating ontology design operations and development. And Chris is going to talk about the Ontology Access Kit, which is a more user-facing tool addressing data scientists and helping them to use our ontologies. So we're going to get at the more concrete level of using some of our tools and infrastructure. And and in the following weeks, we'll talk about the Ontology Development Kit, and then dashboards for coordinating our community and quality control. And then Ubergraph, which is a knowledge base, including all of OBO, and really kind of the culmination of getting all of our projects to work together and integrate in some of the ways that Chris started talking about today. So I'd be really delighted if you can come next week again. And yeah, if you can't make it, we have recordings, and Ken has been putting them up very promptly on the wiki. So if you miss a week, you can go back and watch the recording. Yeah, anything else, Ken or Gary?
Definitely come next week. We'll be continuing all of this discussion. Yes, the recording will be available shortly after the meeting. And I'm also going to try to put together this discussion from SOPUB and the Zoom discussion. And I would also encourage people to start discussing these matters on the Ontolog forum. That's what it's there for. So post your questions and respond, and let's keep this whole discussion going. So
great.
This is Gary. So I would
Well,
also thank Chris and James for this. I thank Thorsten also. And I just wanted to add that after the long list of weeks of very interesting presentations leading to Ubergraph, we also then have next week after that, we have a open discussion session. We will have some prominent ontologists represented. Perhaps James and Chris can be here to sort of reflect on the overall content of what we've heard in the first 5 or 6 or so weeks. So I look forward to that more open discussion.
Great. Thanks, everybody. Let's wrap up there, and hope to see you next week and in the coming weeks.
Thank you, Gary and Ken. James.